Despite being nowhere near as popular as PlayStation consoles, the Sega Dreamcast was great, but what if I told you that originally Sega had a completely different system in mind? During the days of the 32X and Sega Saturn, as the console war raged on, Sega wasn't just losing, they were sinking fast, slipping into a distant third place behind Sony and Nintendo. With Sony tightening its grip and Nintendo flexing its 3D dominance, Sega executives were in full-blown panic mode, so both Sega of Japan and Sega of America began desperately scrambling to stay relevant in a rapidly changing gaming landscape. This desperate last-ditch effort to save themselves would ultimately lead to the creation of the beloved Sega Dreamcast, but not before one final doomed gamble to regain control. Enter the Sega Black Belt, a console that might have saved Sega but instead became yet another casualty of the company's notorious internal chaos. So let's revisit this often overlooked tale. I am Lady Decade, and this is the story of Sega's forgotten next-gen console, the Sega Black Belt. The Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis as it was known in North America, was front and centre of Sega's undisputed golden age. But while the 90s boom cemented Sega as a global gaming powerhouse, what followed was anything but triumphant. This wasn't just a downfall, it was a relentless storm of crippling missteps, bitter internal feuds, and frantic attempts to claw back relevance. Sitting firmly in third place, Sega knew half measures wouldn't cut it anymore. They needed a clean slate, a true next-gen powerhouse that could erase their failures and go head-to-head with their rivals. Their master plan? A next-gen beast of a console that would finally put Sega back on top, or so they desperately hoped. During this time, the Nintendo 64 was flexing its 3D muscle like a bodybuilder at a beach contest. PC gaming was evolving at breakneck speed, and Sony was steamrolling everything in its path with the PlayStation. This was no longer about just staying competitive. This was about survival, and Sega needed to hit back hard. Essentially, if Sega wanted to stay in the game, they needed more than just a great console. They needed a miracle, something so powerful and ahead of its time that it would leave the competition in the dust. So the race was on to make this goal a reality. PC gaming was advancing at breakneck speed, and Sega knew that they only had two options: adapt or die. Let's be clear, PC gaming would end up a huge part of the future, with Steam being absolutely massive today. Part of this is due to the generous deals we can find on the platform, but what's even better is that I know how you can add to your Steam library for even cheaper. Today, all the biggest Sega titles are available on PC, and by using my affiliate links, you can get 19% off the upcoming Pirates Yakuza in Hawaii, 21% off Metaphor ReFantazio, or a huge 77% off the amazing Sonic Mania. Use my links and save money on thousands of different titles and support videos like this simultaneously. Happy shopping, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. As Sega looked beyond the Saturn, the company responded in true Sega fashion by making everything even more complicated. Rather than uniting under a single vision, Sega of Japan and Sega of America did what they did best: fight each other. Instead of one next-gen console, Sega of America and Sega of Japan each developed their own competing vision, kicking off one of the most bizarre internal rivalries in gaming history. By 1996, the PC gaming arms race had reached a fever pitch. Home computers graphically weren't just catching up to consoles, they were leaving them behind. At the time, two graphical powerhouses were leading the charge: Power VR by Videologic, the scrappy underdog of the industry, promising high-end 3D acceleration at a fraction of the cost, and Voodoo Cards by 3DFX, the undisputed king of PC graphics, delivering jaw-dropping visuals so advanced that home consoles looked prehistoric by comparison. In Japan, Sega's engineers threw everything they had into Project Dural, a sleek, cutting-edge console powered by Power VR technology named after Virtua Fighter's metallic final boss. This was Sega of Japan's vision for the future, a machine designed to take on Sony, Nintendo, and the growing PC market. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Sega of America had their own vision. Instead of Power VR, they bet everything on 3DFX's industry-dominating Voodoo graphics. Their machine, codenamed Black Belt, wasn't just another console, it was a direct challenge to Sega of Japan's authority. 2 next-gen consoles, 2 competing visions, 1 inevitable disaster. What could possibly go wrong? On the subject of this weird saga in gaming history, which I guess is not weird at all by Sega's metrics, by 1996, Shoichiro Irimajiri, an experienced Sega executive and former Honda engineer, stepped in as chairman and CEO of Sega of America. Part of his job was, of course, salvaging the Saturn disaster. That year, Sega was bleeding money, its market share was crumbling, and the company was at risk of falling into complete irrelevance. Assessing the Black Belt project, Irimajiri quickly realised the harsh truth. If Sega was going to survive the next console war, they needed more than just good hardware. They needed a technological leap that would put them back on top. Determined to make that leap, he recruited Tatsuo Yamamoto, a former IBM engineer with a reputation for cutting-edge hardware design. If anyone could help Black Belt deliver the raw power Sega needed, it was him. But this was Sega, and if there was one thing that Sega did better than making consoles, it was sabotaging them. Elsewhere, Hideki Sato, the man in charge of Project Dural in Japan, wasn't about to let Sega of America dictate the future of Sega's hardware. To him, Dural was the real next-gen console and Black Belt was nothing more than a distraction, so in a classic Sega power struggle, he yanked Tatsuo Yamamoto straight out of Black Belt and reassigned him to Dural. And just like that, Sega of America's secret weapon was gone, ripped away by their own colleagues. So now, instead of working together as a company, Sega's 2 divisions were now at war again. Naturally, this threw everyone, including the gaming press, into complete chaos. Rumours flew, leaks contradicted each other, and Sega somehow turned their own next-gen console into a puzzle even they couldn't solve. This was a strange time to read about Sega's future. It's also worth mentioning that since Black Belt was a Western project, it dominated coverage in Western gaming media compared to its Japanese counterpart. Most early leaks and speculation revolved around Black Belt, while Dural remained shrouded in mystery. For a time, even the gaming media was convinced Black Belt was Sega's future, blissfully unaware that Sega of Japan had other plans. But let's be honest, game journalists have never exactly been a trustworthy source as far as factually accurate information goes. What we were being told, though, was that on paper the Black Belt had all the markings of a next-gen powerhouse. We would learn about Sega's partnership with 3DFX and that the system was set to use Voodoo 2 and Voodoo Banshee technology, hardware that had already pushed PC gaming to new heights and would have made Black Belt an absolute beast in the console space. For the CPU, it's said that Sega initially experimented with RISC processors from IBM and Motorola, but eventually landed on the SH4, the same high-performance chip that would later power the Dreamcast. Sega of America had a vision of a high-performance, developer-friendly gaming machine, but unfortunately for them, Sega of Japan had other ideas. As time passed, by the summer of 1997, Sega of America wasn't just backing the Black Belt, they were betting the company's future on it. In fact, they went all in, purchasing a 16% stake in 3DFX, a clear sign that they saw the Voodoo-powered machine as Sega's best shot at redemption. If that's not commitment, I don't know what is. But as we've seen time and time again, commitment means nothing when Sega of Japan is the one holding the knife. At the time, gaming magazines were continuing to buzz with reports about Sega's mysterious new console. According to leaks and insider information, Black Belt was shaping up to be a true next-gen machine featuring a CD-ROM drive with 6 times or 8 times speed, ensuring fast load times, a crucial selling point in an era where disc-based gaming was still frustratingly slow, and a built-in modem, much like the unreleased Sega Pluto, proving that Sega was already thinking ahead about online gaming long before it became an industry standard. Spec-wise at least, Black Belt had everything it needed to be a serious PlayStation killer, with later reports even suggesting that the system was shown to developers, so the Black Belt prototypes appear to have been a tangible reality rather than just a vaporware concept. The reaction to the hardware was overwhelmingly positive, especially in the West, where 3DFX technology was already a trusted name in PC gaming. But what really set the Black Belt apart was its developer-friendly approach. Unlike the absolute nightmare that was programming for the Saturn, this new system was designed from the ground up to be easy to work with. Sega of America understood that if they wanted third-party support, they had to make life easier for developers. The results? A system that allowed effortless PC to console ports, a dream platform for studios already investing in 3D gaming. For the first time in years, Sega of America was in a position to get one over on Sony finally. But, of course, Sega of Japan had other plans. Of course they did! During these few years in the States, Tom Kalinske, the beloved president of Sega of America from the 16-bit era, stepped down due to frustrations with Sega of Japan. Shoichiro Irimajiri, along with a gentleman known as Bernie Stolar, would take the reins. The two now run Sega of America together, with Stolar managing day-to-day operations and Irimajiri focusing on hardware and finance. Stolar wasn't afraid to speak his mind and was responsible for one of the most infamous quotes in gaming history. "Saturn is not our future," but to his credit, this is often misunderstood. Many people believe that when he said this at E3 1997, he was publicly burying the Saturn and admitting it was a failure. This misconception paints him as the man who single-handedly killed the Sega Saturn in North America. However, the reality is much more complicated. What Stolar actually meant was that Sega's future was in its next-generation hardware. He was never outright saying that the Saturn was dead immediately, but rather that Sega couldn't rely on it long-term, which was a cold, hard fact. But the problem was the way he said it made it sound like an official abandonment of the console. Developers, retailers, and consumers all took this as confirmation that Sega of America had given up on the Saturn, making its already weak position in North America even worse. This statement directly conflicted with Sega of Japan's stance, as the Saturn was still performing well in Japan. Shoichiro Irimajiri, who also held the position of Sega's global president at the time, had to manage the backlash, as Sega's leadership in Japan was still committed to supporting the Saturn. The growing divide between Sega of Japan and Sega of America over the Saturn and the company's future worsened as a result. Oh dear, oh dear. From a business standpoint, Stolar wasn't necessarily wrong. By 1997, the Saturn was already dead in the US market, with failing sales, poor third-party support, and minimal retailer confidence. However, his aggressive and public approach to moving forward hurt Sega's reputation. Instead of quietly transitioning to the next generation, he made a statement that damaged Sega's credibility and scared off developers even faster than expected. During this time, he threw his full support behind Project Black Belt, believing it to be Sega's only real path forward. As far as he was concerned, Black Belt was the console that could keep Sega alive, but over in Japan, Project Dural was progressing simultaneously. By 1998, Project Dural would be rebranded as Project Katana, and the Black Belt's fate was all but sealed. The shift wasn't just a name change, it was a power move, and this would be the very console that would be commercially released as the Sega Dreamcast, and the Black Belt was dead before it even had a chance to fight. For Sega of America, this was a crushing blow. After pouring resources into the Black Belt, securing 3DFX's technology and winning over Western developers, they were now forced to fall in line behind a console they had no control over. And as if it wasn't bad enough, Sega of Japan's decision set off a chain reaction that would have massive consequences for the company's future. However, apparently we were very close to things transpiring very differently. Tatsuo Yamamoto, the former IGN engineer poached by Sega of Japan, would later reveal just how close the Black Belt had come to becoming Sega's next console. According to him, the Black Belt was nearly set in stone. The hardware was coming together, developers were on board, and Sega of America was ready to roll it out as their next generation system. But at the last minute, Sega of Japan pulled the plug. In a sudden, late-stage pivot, they abandoned 3DFX's Voodoo-based technology and instead placed their bets on the Power VR-based Katana. For the engineers, developers, and executives at Sega of America, this was, of course, devastating. The system they had fought for, invested in, and believed would save Sega was gone, all because Sega of Japan wanted to keep control. But this decision wouldn't just kill the Black Belt, it would upset a lot of people and create some very powerful enemies. So grab your popcorn because this tea is boiling. Even today, reports conflict over whether the Black Belt or the Power VR-based Dreamcast would have been the more powerful machine. Some insiders claim the Black Belt had the edge in raw performance, while others argue that Power VR's architecture offered more flexibility for console development. But while the debate raged on, the first real sign that the Black Belt was dead came from none other than Yuji Naka, the previously legendary and now shamed head of the Sonic team, who has recently gone to jail for insider trading. At the time, Sonic Adventure was being developed as the Dreamcast's flagship title, pushing real-time 3D graphics to their limits. When the shady individual was asked whether the game could run on a PC, Naka flatly stated it was impossible, claiming 3DFX's Voodoo cards were too weak to handle it. This was a not-so-subtle message, as if Sonic Team's biggest game couldn't run on 3DFX hardware, what did it say about the Black Belt console itself? The writing was on the wall, and Sega had already made its choice, and the Black Belt was being buried without a second thought. But while Sega of Japan had moved on, not everyone was willing to let the Black Belt die quietly. Sega of Japan's decision to kill the Black Belt in favour of the Katana didn't just end a project, it sent shockwaves through Sega of America. The fallout was swift and brutal. Mass layoffs hit Sega of America, as dozens of employees who had worked on the Black Belt lost their jobs overnight. Frustrated staff quit in protest, sick of being treated as second-class citizens within their own company, and EA, the biggest third-party publisher in the industry, walked away from Sega entirely, a decision that would haunt the Dreamcast for years to come. What's worse is that many believe EA's refusal to support the Dreamcast is directly linked to the Black Belt being dropped, as EA had also invested in 3DFX technology, expecting it to be the foundation of Sega's next-gen system. So when Sega of Japan ditched 3DFX at the last minute, EA saw it as a betrayal, and they responded harshly by shutting Sega out completely. It's worth noting that this wasn't just a lost partnership. This was a death sentence. EA owned the rights to Madden, FIFA, NHL, and other top-selling sports franchises. Without them, the Dreamcast was missing a critical part of the gaming market, a gap that Sony and Microsoft would exploit mercilessly in the years to come. But as bad as losing EA was, Sega's biggest mistake was yet to come, as one company took their Black Belt betrayal personally. As if losing EA wasn't bad enough, Sega had also made an enemy out of 3DFX themselves, and this was a grudge that wouldn't be forgiven easily. After all, 3DFX had poured millions into developing technology specifically for the Black Belt, expecting their Voodoo graphics hardware to become the backbone of Sega's next generation console, but instead of securing a long-term partnership, Sega led them on, only to ditch them at the last moment in favour of Power VR, and 3DFX wasn't about to let that slide. Furious at what they saw as deliberate deception, 3DFX would end up suing Sega in mid-1998 for a whopping $155 million, claiming the company had misled them into believing their tech would be used, only to secretly negotiate a backroom deal with NEC and Videologic, the makers of Power VR. The legal battle was yet another unwanted distraction for Sega, and they knew they wouldn't win. Instead of letting things drag out in court, Sega settled the lawsuit for $10 million, a mere fraction of the original $155 million demand, but still a huge financial hit for the company already struggling to stay afloat. But 3DFX's revenge didn't stop there. During the lawsuit, confidential technical documents about the Black Belt leaked, giving the entire gaming industry a detailed look at the console that never was. For Sega, it was another humiliating moment. Corporate politics had strangled the Black Belt, and now, thanks to the leaks, everyone knew it. And just to add insult to injury, the Dreamcast's launch was now on the horizon, and it was already shaping up to be one hell of an uphill battle. What a mess. Despite the Black Belt debacle, Sega of America had no choice but to fall in line behind the Dreamcast, a console they had no part in shaping. It wasn't just a bitter pill to swallow, it was a complete surrender, and the console war had now become an internal war at Sega, and Japan had won. But even as Dreamcast's launch approached, Sega of America was still left dealing with the consequences of the Black Belt's cancellation. Things were grim for the Americans as their version of Sega's future had been scrapped. Their relationship with EA was beyond repair, and their market share was shrinking by the day. To make matters worse, the Dreamcast's US launch kept getting delayed, pushing its release back to 1999, giving Sony even more time to prepare their ultimate response. While Sega was still licking its wounds, Sony was getting ready to drop a bombshell that would change gaming forever, with us now knowing exactly where that would lead. With no other choice, Sega of America threw everything they had behind the Dreamcast. If this console failed, there would be no coming back. Determined to avoid another Saturn-style disaster, Sega pumped $100 million into the Dreamcast's marketing campaign, one of the most aggressive pushes in the company's history. The Dreamcast's 9/9/99 launch was a massive success, with strong sales and a lineup of games that truly showcased what Sega was capable of, and for the first time in years, it felt like Sega had a real shot at redemption. But as we now know, it wasn't enough. Because while Sega was celebrating its short-lived comeback, Sony was preparing to destroy them for good. With the PlayStation 2 already in the pipeline, the gaming giant prepared to drop the hammer and crush any hope that Sega had left. Their strategy, a sleek DVD player combined with cutting-edge graphics, a huge library of third-party support and brand loyalty that the massive success of the PlayStation had already cemented. Sega's glimmer of hope didn't stand a chance against the full force of Sony's marketing and technical superiority. In the blink of an eye, the Dreamcast's short-lived reign came to a screeching halt as Sony's PlayStation 2 launched in 2000 and immediately swept the floor with the competition. The Dreamcast may have been Sega's final console, but the Black Belt was their last real chance at a different future, a future where Sega of America had more control, where EA stayed on board, and where Sony's rise to dominance wasn't quite so inevitable. But as we've seen time and time again, Sega's greatest enemy wasn't Sony, Nintendo, or even Microsoft. It was Sega itself. These days, the biggest Sega titles are readily available on PC, and by using my affiliate links, you can grab 19% off the upcoming Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii, 21% off Metaphor ReFantasio, or a massive 77% off the fantastic Sonic Mania. Plus, you'll be supporting my content while saving money on thousands of games at the same time. Or if you want to back my content in a more personal way, access my behind-the-scenes cosplay library and more over on Patreon. See you next time.